Warlord Awaji is an upcoming new samurai indie game from Darkmatter Games, who previously released another game you may have heard of, Warlord Britannia. However, this time, Darkmatter Games seeks to take us instead to war-torn 14th century Japan, deep into the heart of the Nanboku-cho, a unique time period seldom depicted in samurai games. The game itself is described as a first-person action strategy adventure game. It is here, as the Steam page says, players will lead a samurai invasion into the mysterious island of Awaji, recruit, promote, and upgrade your warriors while navigating the ancient world of feudal Japan. If you have played Warlord Britannia, the game is going to be somewhat similar, yet more evolved in terms of its overall scope, and also now containing a story which players will follow throughout their journey. I was recently contacted by Matthew of Darkmatter Games, who asked if I would take part in an interview with the game's historical advisor, author and professor Thomas Conlan of Princeton University, someone I know many of us are likely already very familiar with the work of. What follows in this video is our great conversation, not only about the game, but also about many other fascinating details about the world of pre-modern Japan. I hope you enjoy.
I think what we'll do right away is start out by introducing ourselves. And I guess, Professor Conlan, if you want to go first, and then Matthew.
Okay, sure. So my name is Thomas Conlan. I teach medieval Japanese history at Princeton University. I've been here since 2013. Beforehand, I taught at Bowdoin College. I received my PhD from Stanford, and as an undergraduate from the University of Michigan.
Hey, I'm Matthew, and I'm the creator of Warlord Awaji. That's
All
kind of what
right.
I have going for me.
And Matthew, you did, what was your previous game again that you released?
Yeah, yeah. So that was Warlord Britannia, and so that was kind of a Roman history game. So this is really kind of like the next level in that game series.
Sure. And then just real quick on top of that, could you describe, is the gameplay going to be similar to your previous game?
Yeah, exactly. So it's still going to be kind of like an open world game, where you'll be able to command, like a large army and construct, like forts, and bases and stuff, around the open world. Yeah. So it'll have a lot of the same, kind of warlord stuff, as the first game, except it's just going to be kind of like an improvement, stuff, in all aspects.
Awesome. Very cool. Well, I guess, one of the first questions that I have for you, Professor Conlan. So, like, what compelled you to, I guess, join on for this project? Is there anything that really stood out about it, or I mean, was it just, have you worked on any games before like this?
In my position, I've been studying the warriors and warfare in Japan for a long time. I first started this. I became interested in this in the 1990s. So it's been a while. And for in most of the games and most everything, people tend to look at later times or a larger, span of time. And I found what was really appealing with Matthew's approach is that it's a game about he was really interested in having something in the 14th century. And that's the period that is nearest and dearest to my heart because that's what I worked on my dissertation and I've written widely about warfare in Japan. But I find that time is interesting because it's so different from how we normally conceive of warfare in Japan or the warring states, the nature of the armies and all that. And what I like about it is, in fact, because you have scattered groups of troops, you still have cavalry forces which are dominant, and you have people that could switch sides often. And that's something I think that's very hard to depict in a game format where it's much easier to have like massed groups of troops and that. And so that's what I find really exciting about this project.
Awesome. I do actually have your State of War book here. That's talks about the
I do
the
too.
violent order of the
Oh, they
14th century. I was actually sent this by my good friend Scott from Sengoku Studies, who has another great YouTube channel. So a little plug for Scott as well.
oh
But yeah, regarding the warfare of this time period, obviously. So the game takes place during the Nanboku-cho. That's correct?
Yes.
Okay. Um, what really makes this period, I guess, stand out? Because of course everyone is familiar with the the Sengoku period, the Sengoku Jidai. And of course, you have people that are familiar with earlier times, the Ginpei War, and even later. I mean, lately people have been, really interested in the Mongol invasions of Japan, that thanks to games like Ghost of Tsushima. So, is there something? What really stands out about this particular period that makes it unique from the rest?
It's I would say that what's interesting about it, it really comes after the Mongol invasions, but the premise is very different in that we tend to think of armies as places where there's very strong what I would call command authority. And whereas the general will say something and people basically follow and do things. And what you really see from actually from the time of the Mongol invasions and even before and onward is that this idea of command authority is very weak in Japan, so that people tend to they're scattered. These various warriors will go, they'll fight. They want proof of their battle service. They want proof to show that they showed up, but then they would leave actually the conflict. And so that's what's very different because they had certain goals that and they wouldn't necessarily think about the army as a whole. And so that's something that is so different from how we see either games or modern armies that it's very hard to represent. And I think that's and I think that the other thing that's difficult is that often when you have a game or you have a certain a context, we're so used to the general gives a command and the people follow. But when that is not necessarily the case, it shows you it's very difficult to be a general, but that's very hard to represent on a game because it's just there's so many more vectors that are going on. And that's what's to me is exciting about this, very different about it, is that it really does replicate what's going on in this very interesting time in Japanese history.
Awesome. Yeah. So, I guess, and you've touched on this a bit already, but I might rephrase this question here that I wrote down. But is there, in terms of your help with the project, was there specific areas um, that you really enjoyed, helping with it? Was there anything gameplay wise? I'm not touching the story, obviously, but anything gameplay wise that you were really excited to help with?
I mean, I was excited to to explain certain of the peculiarities of the time, but the fact that like you have, pikes are rare, or you have these giant 7 foot long swords, or you just had this idea that you have these scattered groups. And I think Matthew's been trying to even show like you have some that decide they'll just put a little marker on and I'm joining this force or joining another force, and some that just kind of randomly stand there, not joining any force. And I've always felt that if you could show that ambiguity and kind of chaos and scatteredness, I mean, I actually didn't think that'd be something that you could do in a game format where you used to have like the commander, the army, it's all uniform, they all have their pikes and flags, and then they act that way. And so I found that to be the most exciting in a lot of ways, is just to be able to sort of talk about this very interesting world and to kind of see how it could have been in this format. And I think that when people see this, they'll be very surprised because it will be very different from how you imagine almost everything about the warrior culture and how they're fighting to be. But it's important to realize this is a period of, 60 years of warfare. And so this is actually one of the longest sustained periods of warfare in Japan. And yet it really isn't understood. So if it becomes, more understandable, for me as a historian, I think that's a wonderful thing.
Absolutely. All right. So what I want to do now is move on to a number of the questions here I got on social media. I chose there's three here that I think were really good. Obviously, unfortunately, a lot of the questions were based on different time periods, and I'd want to keep it a bit more focused on what the game does. So what we're going to do, let's start out with this first question here. I got this question on YouTube. This is from Pedro Cantor. He asked, about what is sort of, and we can of course connect this to the Nanbokucho a bit more. These are a bit more general questions, but we can connect it to Nanbokucho, or even if you want to, speak even beyond the Nanbokucho, you can. But he's asking a question about misconceptions, and is there are there any major misconceptions that you think really stand out that are perhaps problematic even in academics today, or just in general with Japanese history? What ones are a bit uh, are still pesky that are around?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, there's some. I could talk a long time. It's a great question. I mean, I could talk a lot. I'll basically talk about one is in terms of this notion of loyalty versus service. And the other is probably methods of fighting. And so maybe I'll talk about the first one is there tends to be the assumption that the samurai, the warrior, is someone who is unusually loyal that will follow commands and follow their general and do things for them. And they don't realize that often the loyalty of these people they had was to their own lands and their holdings. So that meant that they would actually usually not want to go full in if they didn't know what the outcome was. And I think that then people tend to react and say, well, if they're not loyal, then they're treacherous and terrible people. And it's like, no, there's actually a very strong understanding that everyone should protect their house, their holdings. And that if you try to take that, it's unjust. So like this is something before the non-book show, but I found really interesting is that there was this idea that the Kamakura regime was earlier, and sometimes they would confiscate lands from people if they wouldn't show up in court. And then the people would resist to build castles and do things. And it's interesting because then when they would try to chastise them and hunt them down, even the people in authority had sympathy. So they'd be like, oh, we couldn't find anyone, we couldn't do anything. So there wasn't an expectation that people would sacrifice everything for a lord. And that changes over the course of the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries. But what's interesting, really, I'd say the 14th century and the 13th century is the high watermark of this kind of autonomy. And so this idea that if you do have a warrior, their allegiances to their land, to their family, and and when they're confronted with a civil war, they might actually have people fighting on both sides, not to betray something, but to ensure that regardless of what happens, the family will survive. And I think that's so it's not meant to be. I don't think these people as being immoral, depraved, and all that, but it's just they have a different focus of their loyalty, as it were. That's the one misconception. The
Yeah.
second misconception is just how they fight. And it's because if you look at Reconstruction. I mean, everyone loves the samurai sword. The samurai sword is, I tended to argue, is actually not a dominant battle weapon. Okay, it's something that is for personal protection. And it could be used. And what I find great about the 14th century is that there were certain swords, they're called odachi, the really long swords that could be used, be several feet long. The tip only is sharpened and it could be used to stab or to hit people and all that. And so that's very different from how we assume sword. But beyond that, it's still dominated by archery. It's projectiles. And if you think about it, it makes sense because most people don't want to go to hand-to-hand combat unless you really have to. And so just the fact that if you would engage in hand-to-hand combat, even if it be just touching something and running away, would generate special praise. But most of the time people are shooting things at each other. And again, that makes sense. So that's another big misconception. So I could talk more about it, but I'd say those are the two major things that are most problematic. I mean, we could talk about horses and other things as well. I mean, how does a group of horse riders work? The fact that horses aren't absolutely huge, but they're not they're
Yeah.
big ponies, you know what I mean, is another thing that leads to a lot of misconceptions.
You brought up a lot of things there that gave me a million more questions in my head. Um, just real quick, because I know this is always a fascinating topic too, the Odachi. Um, People know, I know, I think a lot of people got exposed to Odachi thanks to that the game Shogun 2, because there's a Odachi
Mm.
unit. Um, Really, when did the Odachi kind of fall out of use? Because I think there's this conception that it was always an option to be used, but obviously, at a certain point in time, they kind of stopped using them. So was there like a certain time frame where they kind of were not being used anymore
Yeah, I
then?
would say, I mean, I don't know exactly. I mean, so the old Achi is heydays the 14th century when you have scattered groups and you see that. And it tends to you'll still see it sometimes 15th century. I mean, I know if you look on the portrait of my samurai source reader,
Mhm.
there's a portrait of Hosokawa Sumimoto. And if you can you show that
Is
just
this the one you were? Yeah.
yeah. And if you look, he's got a thing called a nagamaki, which is actually it's a bound. That long thing he's showing there is actually a long sword where they've then just sort of, and so you see still the 16th century, they're still using something like that.
Yeah.
But it really drops off in the late 15th, 16th century once they go to mass groups and they go to pikes. And the pikes go from being 8 to 9 feet long to 20, 30, 40 feet. I mean, it's like they're really long. And then at that point, the odachi is a meaningless thing. And so what happens is that when you have Japanese swords, I don't know if your audience knows how, like I see Nick behind you, you have a you have a couple swords there. And that the fittings fit on the blade. And there's kind of if you take off the handle, there's a little hole there. And
Mm,
so the tendency is to shorten the sword over time because no one wanted these really long swords.
mm,
So actually, it's unless the old achi were given to a shrine, what tends to happen is the people would shorten the swords, and if you look on the handle, you can see multiple holes, as they would just break off the handle end and then drill a new hole in there, and then make that sword shorter. And so that's why if you look at the 16th, 17th, 18th century, they're all shorter. But if you see an old sword and you look at the handle, sometimes you could see the fact that this was a much longer sword. So that's kind of when does it go out? It's not a certain moment, but basically with the rise of formations of infantry, then they go to pikes, and then once you have everyone close knit, they can have a pike right there. It could be incredibly long. You don't need the odachi because the odachi kind of works when you just have scattered groups. You have a person with this big sword, like no one comes near me. And you just wave it around. So you hit horse legs, and it's a real problem with the odachi. If someone comes too close to you, you can't do anything with it. So it's predicated on this sort of loose, scattered way of fighting. And often they wouldn't even have a scabbard, do you know what I mean? And so,
yeah.
and again, it's you'd use it, it's better than a naginato or pike because it's all metal, it's harder to break. And so you just hit someone, you hit them on the head, you knock them unconscious, and then you dispatch them. And so it's good for that. That's what it's designed for. We know that they start getting better helmet liners over the 14th century because people don't want to get a concussion because you'd be killed. And then we start seeing though in the 15th century, these pikes get way longer. And once you start seeing a group of pikes, you don't wield around a pike, you just poke someone ahead of you because you're in a formation. And at that point, the pikes get way longer. And if you had an old achi, you would be in a very bad situation in, say, like, the mid 16th century with that. So that's why no one would use it. Does
Yeah,
that make sense? Does that?
absolutely. And then you're talking about projectile weapons and how archery was still prominent. Um, I was I've always been surprised to hear about the use of stones as well. Is that something that at this point is something that is being done still? People throwing warriors throwing stones at each other? Because I've heard that was something that was also done uh, quite a bit as well. But I've had a hard time um, tracking that.
Yeah, no, I mean it's you'll see it, and it's often if you're a besieged castle, you get a bunch of boulders and you just roll them down on people. And so that's one way. And even 14th century, there's a couple cases where people were besieging a very sort of, a castle with a lot of rocky outcroppings, and you'll see cases where people are crushed by the rocks. So that's one thing. I mean, later on. And this is something like I noticed in Okinawa. The oldest guns date from the 1460s in Okinawa. And the oldest, actually, well, not the oldest, but interesting fortifications happened right in the 15th century in Okinawa, where they're basically taking coral, and it's very soft, and they're shaping that. And they would use then from the early guns, they would use that rock, they would shape it for bullets. So one difficult thing is we see a rock wound. How do you know is it a gun wound versus
Mm,
someone just throwing a big rock? And I'll be honest, is that my understanding shifted so that when I was doing analysis, I tended to assume later on when you start seeing this big uptick in rock wounds that that's people using early guns. But then I found out all those rock wounds were at one particular castle. And then I see the castle and realize there's just incredible rock outcroppings everywhere. And I was like, I actually think in this case they were just chucking rocks at people. You know what I mean? Because they were there, it was very easy to use, and it was limited to that one time. But they can be a substitute for bullets. And there's a thing called subute, which is just throwing rocks. And that's what people would do when they
mm,
got upset or wanted to have fun. in medieval Japan. I mean, they would throw rocks at each other, and so that's just another thing. And you'd see that it wouldn't be linked to wars. You'd have cases where like people got disputes with their neighbor, and they'd be throwing rocks at each other and all that. One court noble kind of complained like, "Oh, I'm having a bad day. My neighbor's been throwing rocks in my house all day," you know. So there's a long tradition of people throwing rocks.
Is that something that is depicted in the game at all, or is it? It doesn't make it.
Matthew, do we have rocks or not?
We do not have rocks.
Now no
That's
rocks.
the thing.
All right, and then we talked about cavalry as well. Uh, I recently did a video working with his name on online is Good and History, but he wrote a great paper talking about really the evolution of warfare in sort of in the Kanto and Togoku and into that area, and a portion of the paper does deal with cavalry, and
Mhm.
he did bring up some interesting things regarding kind of misconceptions we have with cavalry usage. So I was curious regarding how is cavalry, I guess this is a question for both of you probably. I guess number one, uh, how is it? Is it any different by the Nanbokucho? And then um, how is it portrayed in the game then?
I was curious if you mentioned the misconceptions, what were some of the major ones? I don't know if I've read the
So
article.
there was not only the size of horses in Japan, but of course a lot of warriors using horses instead to ride to a battle, but then dismounting. There's this whole, obviously people love to talk about the great demon cavalry of the Takeda, and a lot of that, of course, is a lot of
Okay.
romanticization. But he was being that his paper focused a lot about Kanto and really how the rise of this, during the Sengoku period, these mounted warriors in Kanto where they fought more on horseback as opposed to other areas in Japan where although there were warriors who were mounted, um, they didn't necessarily stay mounted for the battle.
So to maybe answer the first question, what I see is that if you look at from the Heian period through Nanbokucho and beyond, is that a fairly small squad of cavalry would be fairly dominant on the battlefield. If you have, and if you, I like, there's some great images of the Mongol scrolls. I mean, you're talking 20 to 30. And if you had 20 to 30 men, some women too, that would be on horseback and they had room to fight and to shoot with their arrows, they were pretty much very hard to resist. And that's something, so the Nambok-cho battles, there's always you want to funnel cavalry into swamps. And this is something you see in the hand, the Genpei Wars as well. Or if it's in a city, you want to have them go into towns and you shoot them from houses. And so that's why we see Nambok-cho, they would go on the riverbeds or they would burn places because they wouldn't want to get trapped like that. Now, urban fighting, there aren't that many urban areas in Japan, so it's mostly Kyoto and it's fairly constrained. And I do feel talking about the I mean, I do feel there is a sea change right around the 1450s regarding the dominance of cavalry or not. Because, and I've talked about this in some of my writings, where once you have local officials, for those of you, it's the Shugo who has a lot of, revenue to basically then sustain what I would call a standing army, then you can just give them pikes and then you rely on numbers and then you can have them train because a pike, they don't have to do a whole lot, but they still need to know to be in a formation and do things. And I see the Onion War as a clear example where those defensive tactics of just pikemen occupying land, they can defeat forces of horse riders on an open battlefield. And that was not possible before. And that leads toward larger armies, and that leads to trenches and fortifications and catapults. And that's what you see in Onin. And then, whereas then beyond, it's a lot harder to use cavalry effectively once you start seeing these mass groups of people. So, it'd be interesting to know, like, the Kanto where that would work would have to be where you have a lower population, lower groups where you're doing something, you have some mobility. But I'd say basically that's where you see over the 16th century this movement toward these very large armies with people with very simple weapons and even sometimes just, paper armor covered in lacquer. You just want to occupy lands as opposed to having highly mobile things. Now, some families like the Uesugi were really good at just being very mobile and just coming around and shooting up stuff and kind of leaving. But that's kind of the sea change. So the I just don't see cavalry as being dominant, effective afterwards. And the Takeda stuff, I mean, they got destroyed and then their retainers were incorporated in the Tokugawa group. And so there's this tendency to idealize them and glorify them, but they were never a major player at all, is what I would say. I think that's like if you want to talk about the most overrated family whatsoever, is the Takeda. They're not that powerful. They're not that important. I'm sorry. They're best third to fourth tier.
Oh, you just pissed off so many people. Yeah, I know so many people who love the Takeda, and I'm
I'm so
of that.
sorry to hear that.
I'm of that
Yeah.
opinion too. Where the Takeda, I and I don't know how much Kurosawa affected this with a film like Kagemusha, because that of course is all glorifying the Takeda. But yeah, the Takeda are so beloved, and it's just I whenever I
Mystigy were
think about
way stronger, just to start off. So,
I just the video I just made before this was I was painting a little miniature of Uesugi Kenshin, and I was talking about my favorite clans, and I kind of I was talking about my interest in the Uesugi over the Taira, so it's funny
okay,
that
no,
this
yeah.
is coming up now. Um,
Uh, but I don't mean to be going because I know Matthew could talk about the portrayal of the game, but I'll just mention one other thing. Like to me, I've had a chance to visit the Nagashino battlefield and everything else, and my take on that battlefield is like, the Kurosawa film. I mean, okay, I'll give the Takeda credit; they weren't that stupid. And the whole idea of, how it's shown in the film where they just keep attacking and just,
yeah.
dying. It's so stupid. It's like, no, even Katsuyori wasn't that dumb. But what it was we know that Nobunaga told them that part of his forces were going to join their side. So, like what happened in Sekigahara. So what the Takeda Katsuyori does is he pushes on one wing, and with more guns, the killing range is longer. People are taking real punishment because then he's trying to get another group to surround them. He's trying to
Mm,
circle the whole army. And it turns out Nobunaga was just joking with them, and then he comes around and crushes them, and they do it. But they were engaging in this battle because they wanted to encircle the enemy,
yeah.
and couldn't do so. And the fact of the guns was more of it extended the killing range because I'd say I felt that arrows they could injure people from a long distance, but the killing range of arrows is around 30 to 30 yards. That's when it compares to armor, not more distance. Whereas the gun could kill people, say 50 yards. So it doubles the killing range. And that way, if you have people commanding things and you could see them, you could shoot them and they take inordinate casualties. And so that's kind of what's going on
Mhm.
there. So Nobunaga did a number on them. It was very clever. But it was, he was very good at doing those kinds of things. So he was very tactically skilled. The Takeda weren't that stupid, but they weren't that powerful either. The
Yeah.
Imagawa were way more powerful. The Wisugu were way more powerful. The Hojo were way more powerful. Yeah. But anyways, I don't mean to. I imagine all the Takeda fan club is going to get really
Oh
upset.
yeah. Well, the one thing I said is okay. So if you look at the Takeda of Kai, and you remove Shingen, is the clan still even significant at that point? I mean, I know Shingen gets all this credit, but it's like, okay, you take him out of the situation. Like, what is
Actually,
left then?
you know that Takeda controlled three regions? No one knows
Or
that. Kai, and
Kai,
then Wakasa, which is like Obama north of
yeah,
Kyoto,
and then
and then the other is Hiroshima.
yeah,
And they got wiped out in those other regions. So they got
mm,
wiped out everywhere. You know what I mean? And so I found what's interesting is that arguably the ones out in Aki and Hiroshima were somewhat, but the Oichi destroyed them entirely. So no, I don't. Kai doesn't have the population, and it's not a strategic
yeah,
region. And I think that even like people. Like the Oda, you emphasize the fact that they're upstarts when in fact they were deputy shugas for a long time, and even they were providing the second most amount of money to the court for ceremonies before Nobunaga even arose. So they were way more powerful. So the Takeda were, I mean, they were important Buddhist monks, but it's more the fact that they were destroyed that everyone could make Takeda into whatever they wanted them to be. And so I kind of see there's a lot of in the Tokugawa period where they kind of glorify the Takeda. in that way that they couldn't with the surviving force. But no, they were never a player. Um, Boy,
Well,
that's strong. But anyways, oh well.
as long as we are ruining people's perceptions and taking no prisoners, we should. I just want to ask, what about the people love to glorify the date as well? And that's one of my biggest pet peeves when they over glorify the date. Do you have the same opinion on that, or do you think they deserve more credit?
I mean the dot. Well, at what time? So
I think as soon as you get into Masamune's rise, because everyone loves Date Masamune.
yeah, I mean the date. I mean, the Date are I mean, they're very interesting because they start out as actually a Western warrior that moves east. That's one thing that's really weird. You know, in ancient times, they were off in the Western Japanese region. They go east, and they don't really strike it big until they're given judicial authority and authority over mining and stuff like that around the 1480s. So they're relatively upstart, you know what I mean? We don't know a lot about what's earlier, but yeah, they do seem to be powerful. Um, but they are so lucky not to get killed by Hideyoshi.
Mhm.
And I kind of I don't know. I lived in Sendai for 2 years. I know how everyone like glorifies,
Yeah.
Date Masamune, but I kind of got the sense that he kind of lost out and he just decided to become the big guy in this little area or the area of the north like that. How powerful were they? I mean, that's a good question because they actually are a little bit more savvy and they don't really fight that much. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? So they know, I mean, so I don't know, but the fact that they don't have a castle and what I would say is why the Date are actually more powerful is that one, they have local authority, and two, they never move. So that means it's not just limited to the warriors, but it sort of pervades through the whole society. So when I think about like in later times, who are the most powerful daimyo, I would put them up there with the Mori and with the Shimazu and with the Date. They are of a class of their own because they've never been moved, and so they have a very deep control over things. So I think they're very late, but I do think they're very powerful. But they could have been destroyed by Hideyoshi, but they luckily for them weren't, and the
Yeah.
Tokugawa feared them too. So I actually would say no, they're pretty powerful. I would say I feel that
Okay.
they would have been hard to take in that sense. But they were also a little bit more savvy.
Yeah. But does that power necessarily translate to relevance either? Because like
Yeah,
it's
I see
north in
because
the
the
midst of all
period
the
that I deal with is a little bit late. They come on very late. And I do feel that latter half of the 16th century, they're important, but they weren't really I mean, they become a player in the 16th century, and with the gold and other things. So they're kind of really, they're rising up. And so that's where I would sort of see it, that beforehand, they're not as prominent, but they're definitely the trajectory is like this. You
Mhm.
see what I mean? And that's why if you look at it later on when they're sending out their own ships and doing all that, yeah, they're definitely up there. So I would put them as a story of someone who one of the ones who gains great power over the course of the 16th century.
Okay. Very cool. Very
Yeah, not like Takeda.
cool.
Yeah.
All right. Going back a bit, of course, back to the game. Earlier, you mentioned there were perhaps some females involved in some of these mounted groups as well. And one of the questions we have is from someone, I think it's Peregrine Tintinfish is the person's name. He asked about female warriors, and his question has to deal with evidence of female warriors. I know we can connect this to the period of the game. But then he also asks about armor. Is there any armor specifically tailored for female warriors?
Hmm. Yes. So I've seen the most, I mean, in State of War, I have a picture of one suit for this Tsuruhime, who's a 16th century suit of armor that's tailored for the female anatomy. I've also seen, it's slightly later, but I've seen some female armor in Okayama for that. So you do see suits of armor for women. You do see references in sources where people are fighting and women are fighting, and there's a famous passage in the Chronicle in Tairaku where according to the Times says we saw forces mostly made of women, and so women could fight on horseback when it's dominant archery. Um, I don't think gender matters as much as we think because actually being a woman it has a lot of advantages on horseback because you're a little lighter. I mean, once I went to there's the Yabusame where the horse riders come and hit targets, and they actually had horses that were close to the original, Japanese horses. Maybe they were the original ones. I don't know. And they're real small. And you had this woman on that, and she was doing really well, and you had a guy on it, and he was too tall for the horse. And so the horse kept stopping it, and knocking him off, and he fell off like 5 times. And so actually, if you are too big, that's a problem. And so I would say that women and men, is on mounted horseback, if you're from a warrior family, you'd be training early. And you probably wouldn't really even know because the armor wasn't that distinct. But if you're too tall and too big, there was actually a selective disadvantage to that in Darwinian terms. So we know if you look at the Oshu Fujiwara of the North, these people were over 6 feet tall, and the last lord, Yasuhiro, they talked about the fact the guy was just too big and his horse couldn't handle him, and it would be sweating all the time, and only a certain horse could do it, and then he died. And so that's one thing I think it's kind of interesting, about that. But there was
Yeah.
no disadvantage. We do find references to women fighting during the Onin War, and there's been some studies of even 16th century of the Kubitska, where they have like a lot of burial heads after a battle, and they found actually was really interesting. There's a lot of women of not old or young, but of basically like from 18 to the 30s
Hmm.
that were there, and so they tend to think that this was like in Suruga, so that's more closer to the Kanto, in that region. But
Yeah.
you do have cases where it seems like there was a pretty decent participation of women in battle. When Kamakura fell, there's a man and a woman with battle wounds that are buried facing each other. And that probably dates from 1333. So I would say that it wasn't dominant. I would guess 10-20%, but it wasn't something that people would say like, oh, wow, women are fighting or they're using different weapons or something like that. I
Yeah.
think that in a world where archery is the dominant thing of the elite warrior, then you'll see a lot of women fighting. If you look at, Central Asia and Mong, that's a very common thing you see like that. So that's what I would say about that.
Okay. And then Matthew, in terms of the game, is there any female warriors depicted in the game, or is what shows up?
Yeah, so far I don't have any plans on depicting female warriors just because it seemed like something that I don't want to say like it's not worth, the effort to put into the game, but it seemed like something that would be, like the sort of thing that I could add later if like time allows, but there's just so many things, like I need to add into the game to kind of get it, to the baseline of, like historical authenticity. So that's what I would say on that. But I would say that there would be some female characters actually appearing in the game's storyline. So that's somewhere where you could see some female characters.
Awesome. Very cool. All right. So the final question that I have here, it's from Jonathan 607, and then he's asking about just the size of armies. Um, so the typical samurai army, and once again, we can frame this towards the 14th century if we want. But what kind of size are we looking at in terms of armies at this time?
It's a good question. I mean, I'd say my guess is if we look back, even the Mongol invasions, for the amount that a province could do is a couple of thousand. And if you look at the Battle of Minatogawa when Kusunoki Masashige, it's like one wing of the army gets annihilated. And the sword, I can't remember the exact number. I thought it was like, we killed 790 enemy. It was around that. I don't remember exactly the number. It's just under 800. And that's about half an army. So that if we say 16, we're talking 3,000, something like that would be for a major extended conflict. When I did looking at petitions, I counted people, I counted 1,800 wounds of dead or whatever that over a period of 60 years. So I'm guessing it's in the thousands. And it's really, you find estimates of it in the thousands, even the early 16th century. And I think that that's the big change is by the mid 16th century, they're able to get tens of thousands. You know what I mean? And there are some major changes that happen. And that's where they get radically larger, but it's small. And that's where also the scatteredness makes sense. You see what I mean? That's what I would say that even for even a major conflict, The biggest battles, the ones where they're really trying to fight for the realm, would be between 3 to 5,000 total.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and this is actually one of the reasons why I actually wanted to do this as the time period, because it just really works in terms of, like the unit sizes. It just works, like much more for being like a warlord game versus being like a total war game.
Yeah.
You like where you can have, tens of thousands of units, but like in my game, it would be more in like the hundreds is the thing. So I think it actually makes the game, like kind of more authentic, because I don't, like necessarily need like to cheat, and say like, okay, I need to reduce all the army sizes, 1,000th or something,
Mhm.
because then it would be like obvious, like, okay, I mean, there's the, it's like the Battle of Sekigahara, and it's like we only have, like 100 characters per side. It would be kind of like lame, So I feel like in this time period, it just kind of makes it work like a lot better for a game like this. So that's one thing I would say, and also it also kind of it makes it interesting because then I can kind of group people into these like smaller kind of nuclear groups, much more manageable for actually like a player who's going to be able to control them and stuff in the game. And so that's kind of like one other thing I was hoping that that we could kind of talk about a little bit is kind of how like the groups in the game would work.
Sure.
And so I can kind of get that rolling a little bit because it's linked onto this question. But so how it'll work in the game is you'll essentially have these samurai who are called Gokenin. And so these Gokenin have sort of a group that like accompanies them. And so that's basically going to form like the central kind of like tactical unit for the game. And yeah, yeah. And if Tom wants to add anything about how those groups kind of work.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think Matthew, that's great. It's like that's one thing I really like about it. It shows the scattered nature of it. It shows the numbers. So, like when I said 3 to 5 is the largest it would be, those are exceptional circumstances. And so I feel that for most of the game, what it's showing is pretty
Right.
much what it's like. And there are cases then where different groups have their identification, and so like a really good commander would basically know all the warriors that would be there. You know what I mean? They would
Right.
know who to write to. They know the symbols and they know that. And I think that if you're part of this game, then you kind of gain the degree of knowledge that like a commander reasonably could have. And so yeah, it's to me, I was just really so pleasantly surprised as I seen this. It's like, wow, this really does show just how small groups of people are over a scattered range. And that's where you can see where cavalry matter or where you want to have a big sword and like no one gets near me. You know what I mean? Like that. And it's the Kokenian groups that Matthew was talking about, these are the people that have it literally means householder. So they have their house lands. That's what they thought about. That's what matters the most to them. And so you really, I mean, you really get a good sense of that. And I also agree that instead of fudging it and suddenly trying to create an army of, like I mean, these armies of 100,000, they only come in really late, and I think to have something of the scale the way it does, this game does that very well. And I think that anyone playing it'd be very informative just to get a sense of how difficult it is to understand what's going on and that kind of, I think that's something that often you don't see in these contexts, right? Where everything you just know, oh, the one side, and that. And here we don't have uniforms either. And so
Mm.
it's you can have people change their lead. So it is a lot. I think it's like a completely different world and a completely different experience. And it's so different. It appears very fresh. And I do feel this shows that quite well.
Cool. It's awesome. All right. Well, those were the questions that I had for this. Is there anything else either of you would like to add about the project or things that you really found to be either going really well or really great to see?
Yeah, yeah, I would say one of the things that I really liked, is how the characters' equipment has kind of worked out. So we really put like a lot of effort into how like the armors look and how you sort of have like a gradation of units. Like some people like really don't have any armor, and then it goes all the way up, to like the fully armored. with the helmet, and everything. So I really like how that kind of depicts this because I feel like it's very, very accurate to scrolls and stuff, and which is not really something you see in a lot of video games. I feel like a lot of video games they have more of just like kind of like a one or a zero, like have a fully armored guy, like versus someone who really doesn't have a lot of armor, but there's not really that kind of like sliding scale, you know. But yeah. So there's that, and then there's just also kind of the depiction of all the different sorts of weapons, and like how some people wouldn't really be using a weapon, that like another sort of person would use, because like the Odachi, for example, expensive sort of weapon, So really that's just going to be kind of limited to like the higher class people, and then everyone kind of on the lower end of the spectrum would have more of a spear, or in the best case, would have like a naginata, or like any sort of like bow weapon. Um, yeah, so there's that sort of thing as well. So I feel like it'll be a really, really cool way for people just to kind of see, like what one of these battles might have actually looked like, because we're really trying to get all of, like the ratios and stuff correct too. So 30% of people have a naginata, and then maybe, 15% of people have a spear, and stuff like that. So if you actually looked at like one of, the battles in the game, it would be like as close as you can really get, for something, India Nambacho. So yes, that's was one of the things I wanted to highlight on. I don't know if you wanted to
Yeah, no, Matthew, I'd say that was one thing was really fun
add
is
anything to that.
sure um is that, for example, we were actually looking like through scroll because I was talking about how based on the status, like the armor, like legging armor, whether you have nothing at all or shin guards or something which protects the calf. And we kind of realized also that there's the gradations of like, the highest ranking, the second, the third, the fourth. But then the difference between those that are going to use shock weapons, like they would always have the Colte,
Right.
the gloves and the chain link. And then we're looking at then the archers, and like they never had the gloves on.
Yeah.
And actually then the helmet where favors of the helmet, they would take off the shikoro edging and just have the hachi bowl there, or real simplified it, just have like a cloth or something. And because again, it get in the way of that. And what I found is like, I've been looking at this, but until we start really going through this, I never realized that even people the same status, you would prepare differently
Mhm.
if you're going to be an archer or not. And that I thought that was something that was pretty interesting that we were really going through. And it's like I had actually never
Yeah.
appreciate that, but when you really think about it, it makes sense. You don't want that. If you're an archer, you want to have the bow right there, and you don't want the gloves, and there's no need for the gloves. And that's why you're not gonna, if you're an archer, you're not gonna get close to hand-to-hand combat. So if that situation comes in, you're gonna leave. You see what I mean? And it just makes sense because you wouldn't be ready for it. And to be a good archer, you're not gonna have the defensive things you need for hand-to-hand combat. And that's where they could be skirmishers or on horseback or what have you. But so it really, by looking at it at this level of detail, it is illuminating, and that was probably something that I had actually never noticed until we were going through this. Like, oh, this makes sense. And then once you look at it, you can see it's very consistent. And so that's really it's been quite fun to do it at this time because I find this time is just there's so many changes in armor and there's so many things that are happening, and it's still generally different from what we expect. It's pretty interesting overall.
Yeah, I'm really really excited to see how it all comes together. Coming in, I wasn't exactly sure what to expect, but just hearing what you guys are talking about here today, there's a lot I'm really looking forward to seeing now, and I know certainly people who watch my videos and stuff are going to be very excited for it as well.
Yeah,
Hmm.
that's awesome
Thank you. Yeah.
to hear that.
So I guess for my final fun question, um, Northern Court or Southern Court?
I have an opinion on this, but it might spoil the story, so maybe I shouldn't say anything. But if you want to speak on
I'll
that,
just
When you
blur
say
it
Northern
out.
Court versus Southern Court, do you talk about where one's personal affinities lie?
Which would, if you were a samurai right now, who would you think is the legitimate court and
Oh,
who?
Northern Court, 100%. No question. No question.
Yeah.
That's easy.
Northern Court all the way.
And Northern Court all the way.
Very cool.
But now I got to talk a long time about what we mean by legitimacy and all that. And that's
Yeah, it's a whole other campaign. That's awesome.
Yeah,
yeah,
well,
yeah.
like one thing I will add is that this kind of central question about legitimacy is probably going to be one of the central kind of elements of the story. So I'm not going to spoil anything more than that, but I'll say that that will be something that's very, very huge for this game. So people, like who are kind of interested in that, I think will really find this very interesting.
Awesome. Very cool. I look forward to seeing more. And I want to thank both of you for coming and having this great chat. This was amazing. Very very enlightening. I learned a lot of new great information as well. So thank you both. Thank you, Matthew. Thank you, Tom.
Thank
And
you.
yeah, I will. I
Thank you,
look
Nick.
forward to posting more news about the game as things progress.
Great.
Thanks,
Awesome.
thanks for the great questions,
Much.
and
Yeah.
it's really a pleasure. Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you. It was really awesome.
Alright, that about wraps it up. This was truly a great conversation that I was honored to be a part of. Down below I will leave links to, of course, where you can find more info about Warlord Awaji, but also more work from Thomas Conlan. With that said, thank you for watching, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell if you enjoyed this video and found it to be most informative.